There is something happening to believers right now that nobody in your church is talking about. And I do not say that to scare you. I say it because I used to be the one doing it. Before I gave my life to God, I spent years operating inside a system that most Christians do not even believe is real. I sat in rooms where names were spoken, where objects were handled, where decisions were made about people who were on their knees praying and had absolutely no idea what was being arranged around them. I watched it. I participated in it. And when I finally got out, I made a promise that I would not stay silent. What I am about to share with you today is not a sermon. It is not a theory. It is a testimony from someone who crossed over from the other side and came back to tell you exactly what she saw. But I need you to stay with me, because what I am going to reveal in the next few minutes explains something that most believers experience their entire lives but never fully understand. Why prayer feels like it hits a ceiling. Why certain patterns never break, no matter how much you fast. Why some doors just will not open. Stay with me, because the answer is not what you think it is. I want you to think about someone you know. Someone who loves God. Someone who prays. Someone who shows up. Someone who is doing everything they were taught to do. And yet something in their life just keeps circling. The same financial pressure. The same broken relationships. The same health issue that comes and goes. The same door that opens and then closes. Over and over again. Now, I want to tell you what I used to see when I looked at a person like that. I was operating in darkness. We did not choose targets randomly. That is one of the first things people get wrong. They assume that spiritual attacks are scattered, that they are random misfortunes. They are not. There was always an assessment. Always a reason why one person was chosen and another was left alone. And here is what made someone vulnerable. It was not whether they prayed. Almost everyone we targeted prayed. It was not whether they went to church. Most of them did. What we looked for was something far more specific. We looked for gaps. Not moral gaps necessarily. Spiritual gaps. Places where the authority that should have been covering them was not actually in place. Places where they were busy making noise in the spirit, but not actually holding ground. I remember watching a woman once. And I say this carefully, because I want you to understand what I mean without causing you to live in fear. She prayed every single morning. Long, passionate prayers. But there was something disconnected about it. It was like she was speaking into a room where the signal had been cut. And those of us who knew how to read the spiritual atmosphere around a person, we could sense it. Not because she was weak, but because something in her spiritual alignment was off in a way she could not see. I used to know how to read that. And today, I am going to use that same knowledge, now surrendered to God, to help you understand what the enemy sees when he looks at you, and more importantly, what you can do about it. But first, I need to tell you something that most churches are teaching incompletely. Because if I had heard this when I first came to faith, it would have saved me years of confusion. Here is what I was never told when I first walked into a church. And honestly, it is what changed everything for me once I finally understood it. The problem is not that believers are not praying enough. Most of the people I encountered spiritually were praying constantly. The problem is that prayer without legal authority in the Spirit is like sending a letter with no address on it. It goes somewhere, but it does not always arrive where it needs to go. Let me explain what I mean by that. In the system I was part of, before any move was made against a person, the first thing that was examined was not their strength. It was their covering. It was whether or not they were standing on ground that was actually theirs to stand on. Because if someone was genuinely aligned, genuinely walking in the authority that belongs to a child of God, there was very little that could be done against them without enormous resistance. That kind of person was not impossible to touch. But they were costly. And most of the time, they were not chosen. What made someone easy to work against was not their sin necessarily. It was disconnection. It was praying words they did not own. Declaring things they had no relationship with. Going through spiritual motions that had no root underneath them. And I watched this happen in the lives of sincere, devoted, genuinely loving believers. They were not faking their faith. They were simply missing something that no one had ever taught them. The kingdom of darkness does not fear noise. It does not panic when someone raises their voice or says the right religious phrases. What it fears, what genuinely creates interference in the plans being made on the other side, is alignment. Spiritual authority that is rooted. Legal ground that has been properly occupied. And most of what is being taught in churches today about spiritual warfare is focused almost entirely on the battle. And almost nothing on the position you have to be standing in before the battle ever begins. That is the piece that is missing. And that is the piece I am going to walk you through right now. But I want you to hold something in your mind as I do this. What I am about to describe goes deeper than most people realize. There is a layer to this that even many experienced believers have never seen. And by the time we reach the end of this, you are going to understand something that will permanently change the way you approach your spiritual life. The first thing you have to understand is that the spirit realm operates on the principle of legal access. Not emotional access. Not how loud you pray. Not how much you cry. Legal access. And when I say legal, I mean something specific. I mean that the enemy does not simply trespass into a person's life. He locates an opening. A point of entry that has been made available, sometimes knowingly, sometimes through things passed down, through family lines. Sometimes through agreements made so long ago, that the person living today has no memory of them. This is something I understood deeply from my years on the other side. Before an assignment was carried out against someone, there was always a search for the door. Because without a door, the work was exponentially harder. Not impossible, but costly and slow. With a door, things moved quickly. Now what is a door in practical terms? It can be an unresolved pattern of sin that has become a foothold. It can be a generational covenant that someone in your bloodline entered into decades before you were born. It can be an object, a gift received from someone with bad intentions. And this part I want you to hear carefully. Because in my former life, I knew how this was done, and I want you to understand it, not to live in fear, but to live in wisdom. Physical objects can be used as points of spiritual contact. This is not superstition. This is something I operated in personally. A gift given with intention. Money exchanged in a specific context. Something left behind in a space. These things were used as what I can only describe as anchors. A way of saying to the spirit assigned, here is the connection. Here is where you enter. And the person on the receiving end had no idea. The reason the kingdom of darkness fears a believer who understands this is because once you understand how the door works, you can close it. Once you know the enemy needs legal access, you begin to live in a way that systematically removes that access. You do not just pray louder. You pray smarter. You examine what you have received, and from whom. You address things in your bloodline, with the authority that belongs to you in Christ. You stop leaving doors open through spiritual passivity, while still going through religious motions. And here is the part that most teaching skips entirely. This is not about becoming obsessed with the enemy. It is not about seeing a demon behind every inconvenience. It is about understanding the architecture of how the spirit realm actually functions so that you can stand in a position where the enemy has nothing to work with when he comes looking for a door into your life. The Bible says the prince of this world came and found nothing in Jesus. Nothing. That is the standard. Not perfection in a religious sense, but alignment so complete that when darkness comes searching, it finds no legal foothold. No open contract. No inherited door that has never been addressed. That is the life you were called to. And the path to it is simpler than you have been told. But it requires something that casual Christianity almost never demands. It requires intentionality about what you carry, what you allow, and where your authority is actually rooted. And there is one more layer to this that almost no one talks about. Something that happens specifically after a person receives deliverance or a major spiritual breakthrough. Something that I witnessed from the other side with my own eyes. And it is the reason why so many believers experience freedom for a season, and then find themselves right back in the same condition they were delivered from. This is the part I almost did not include. Because it exposes something the enemy would very much prefer you never understood. When genuine deliverance comes, when a breakthrough finally breaks through, there is a window immediately after that moment that is more dangerous than most people realize. Not because the freedom was not real. It was real. But because what a person does in the days and weeks after deliverance determines whether that freedom becomes permanent, or simply a temporary relief. I watched this from the other side. When an assignment against someone was interrupted by genuine spiritual authority, the response was never to give up. It was to wait. To observe. To look for the moment when the person, relieved by their breakthrough, slowly relaxed the very things that had made the breakthrough possible. Jesus described this precisely. An unclean spirit leaves, wanders, and returns to find the house empty, swept, and put in order, and it brings 7 others worse than itself. Most people read that as a warning about sin. It is also an exact description of what happens when deliverance is received, but the space left behind is not filled with something permanent. What fills that space is not just more prayer. It is identity. Deep, settled, legally established identity in who you are. Because a person who knows exactly what authority they carry is not someone who can easily be The believers who struggled most after breakthrough were almost always the ones who received their freedom with joy. Testified, moved on, and then slowly drifted back toward the patterns and relationships that created the opening in the first place. Not because God failed them, but because the door had never been fully sealed. That is entirely preventable. Not through spiritual exhaustion or constant warfare mentality. Through alignment. Through a life so rooted and ordered that darkness simply has nowhere to land. I want to leave you with something that took me a long time to understand after I came to faith. And it is this. You were never called to live under constant attack. That is not the Christian life. That is not what was purchased for you. The life you were called to is one of authority, of order, of a settled peace that does not depend on the absence of opposition, but on the presence of something the opposition cannot move. What I carried out of darkness when I left was not just a testimony. It was an understanding of how the spirit realm actually functions. And what that understanding has shown me, now that I stand on this side, is that the believer who walks in genuine alignment is not a person the kingdom of darkness approaches casually. They are costly. They are covered. They are standing on ground that has been legally occupied and spiritually maintained. That is available to you. Not as a reward for spiritual perfection, but as the inheritance of someone who knows who they are, who understands the authority they carry, and who has made the daily decision to seal every door that darkness needs to operate in their life. You do not need to live afraid. You do not need to spend your days scanning for attacks or reading threats into every difficulty. What you need is to be so correctly positioned that your life itself becomes a testimony to something the enemy cannot explain and cannot touch. Heaven sustains the one who remains aligned. That is not a motivational phrase. That is a spiritual principle I watched operate from both sides. And I can tell you with everything in me that it is real. If something in what I shared today stirred something in you, something that felt like recognition, like a piece of a puzzle you have been carrying for a long time finally settling into place, I want you to sit with that. Do not rush past it. Because sometimes, the most important thing God does in a moment like this is not give you more information. It is give you the clarity to finally act on what you already know. There is more to this conversation. There are layers to what I have shared today that we have only begun to open. And if you are ready to go deeper, stay close to this channel. Because what is coming next may be the peace you have been waiting for.